Mohandas Gandhi was the most distinct, extraordinary individual of the last several hundred years of Indian history. See, there was a British view. There was one British officer at that time who said that, the Rani of Jhansi is the greatest of Indian men. Kasturba, who is generally been sidelined and ignored, that is Gandhi's wife, who has generally been ignored in many of the conventional histories, that Kasturba very often took over the role of her husband.
Hello, I'm Shreya Sinha and you're watching ABP Live. At a time when social media is playing a major role in shaping political narratives and WhatsApp forwards is being used to discuss history, we have a book, Insurgency and the Artist, by Professor Vinay Lal that gives us a lucid account of what happened during the freedom struggle through the lens of art produced during that time. So without much further ado, let's get the conversation started. Welcome to ABP Live, Professor Lal.
Thank you.
So you write in your book that reading is as alien to many as shame to professional politicians. So is that the reason you chose the medium of visuals to talk about history? And is there a target group, the younger generation maybe, that you wanted to, sort of learn more about history?
Well, let me begin by saying that I think that we are living in a visual age today. Now, images have always been with us, but I think it is a fact that the written word no longer has a kind of attraction that it once did. There's a very famous magazine published from the United States, known all over the world to people who really like to read. It's famous for its cartoons. Many years ago, it had a cartoon where a young boy is handed a book, and the caption says, and his father is standing there, and the caption says, "Son, there is no button for the book. All you have to do is turn the pages." Because this young child is expecting that there will be some button, he can open it, it's like a computer, and so of course it's very humorous because he's saying it's a book, all you have to do is just flip the pages. All right. So in some ways the written word is becoming increasingly alien, but that's not the principal reason why I wrote a book on the freedom struggle and the images that were generated at that time. I want to stress one thing. This is a book which is confined largely to the images that were generated by the artists contemporary to the struggle. Because since independence, since 1947, over the course of the last 70, 80 years, we have obviously had a large number of artists who have interpreted the freedom struggle and continue to do so. But I'm not looking at that word. I'm looking at how artists at that time were imagining the freedom struggle. And one reason I think it's important to look at these images is because the question here is whether they offer some insights into the freedom struggle, into the independence movement, that perhaps the written word does not. Right? So then we have to understand, how do images and the written word, how do they complement each other? How do these two narratives, because when you assemble images together, you put them together in a certain way, just like you put words together to constitute a sentence, then you use sentences to constitute a paragraph, and paragraphs to constitute a chapter, and so on. So when you assemble the images in a certain way, position them, interpret them in a certain way, what they provide is a narrative. Then the question is, how is this narrative different?
Yeah, that was my next question. We will get into details of the different images, remarkable, striking ones. But when you were compiling and when you were in the process of making the book, did it offer you a fresh perspective or a different perspective about the freedom struggle?
Absolutely. There's no question about that. I'll give a very simple illustration. In 1930, the Salt Satyagraha took place, the Salt March. And subsequently, Gandhi was invited to England for what was a series of conferences called the Round Table Conferences. So when he went to the Round Table Conference, the second Round Table Conference, in many months after the Dandi March, a lot of the people at that time in India, when he came back, said that Gandhi has come back empty-handed. That essentially the British were very gentlemanly, but they more or less deceived him, because what did he get in return? He got nothing. Now, you see, there is one image here, which I actually have in the book, which is almost a little cartoonish, where Mohandas Gandhi, the King Emperor, Sarojini Naidu, I think it's, I'm trying to remember the other person who's Malviya, Madan Mohan Malviya, they're seated at the table, and Gandhi's hand is extended towards the King Emperor, and they're shaking hands. And you can see that Gandhi really is the dominant figure in this image. Now, by sheer virtue of the fact that he is shaking hands on equal terms with the King Emperor, the person who did the sketch is suggesting that something had changed, something had been transformed. That maybe India didn't get independence on the spot, as it were, but now India was being acknowledged for the first time as an equal in some respects. And so what this artist is doing is presenting an interpretation which the history books were not, because a lot of the historians would say Gandhi came back empty-handed. And that's the common perception back at that time.
So my next question was about Gandhi, but before that, I would like to ask you that these images, do they merely present the political image of the day, or did they also help? You know, because art and literature, they also sort of motivate people to take some steps, or motivate or provoke. Did they also help in shaping the freedom movement to any extent?
Well, I think that we would have to answer in the affirmative. I would have to say, yes, they probably did, but it's going to be, you know, this is not something that we can say with absolute certainty. But look at it this way. If you have a large number of images that are being generated of Mohandas Gandhi, or let's take another example of Subhash Bose, then the question is, how are these images being received by the public? Because to be able to answer to your question, one would have to be able to say, what was the impact of these images? Now, we can't really measure the impact of these images. We know very little about how they were circulated, how they were used. But I think it is unquestionably the case that these images generated a certain narrative, and then this narrative becomes, I think, important in certain ways. I wouldn't go so far as to say that these are necessarily highly influential in the way in which, let's say, the poetry of Subramaniam Bharati might have been influential, you see, in shaping a certain view. Or I think, for example, the stories of Premchand, which are contemporary to the freedom struggle, I think that these were extremely important in shaping the worldview of some people at that point in time. Now, were the images similarly influential? I think it would be more difficult to say that with certainty, but I think that to some extent that is certainly the case.
Yeah. When we talk about narratives, it's a very popular word now, right? Yes. So there is a certain narrative that India needs a strong, brute, masculine force to protect it. Right now, this is what the consensus is. And when we talk about Gandhi, he's always thought about as this spiritual guru, always the torchbearer of ahimsa, and we put all these people, Bose, Gandhi, Maharana Rana Pratap, somewhere we box them, right? So your book talks about the different ideology that each of them had, but they still came together for India's independence. So how did the artist, display or portray the different ideology, yet have them in the same frame? For example, there is an image in your book which puts Maharana Pratap, Shivaji, Bose in the same frame.
Yes.
So how did, because I don't know about diversity in India right now, but it seemed that during the freedom struggle, the artist who portrayed these art back then could diversify. So what would you say on that?
Well, there is a complex set of considerations that we would have to look into. I'm going to be brief in trying to explain, I think, my worldview in relationship to these images and what I think they are doing, okay? Particularly with respect to the question, because you really posed two questions in a way. One is the question of how is it that different competing worldviews of the freedom struggle at that time, how are they being accommodated in the art? Because Subhash Bose and Bhagat Singh and Mohandas Gandhi didn't think the same way. They were certainly all patriots, right? But they didn't all think the same way. So your question really is, how are these views accommodated within the worldview of the artists, right? And then there's a second question of, which is related to the first question, the question of national unity at that time. So I think we can first thing is to understand is that the same printmaker who is making a print, let's take somebody like Prabhu Dayal. We know the name of a couple of the artists, Roop Kishore Kumar and Prabhu Dayal are two artists who were working for someone by the name of Sundar Lal Agarwal, who was, if one looks at his prints, he described himself as a picture merchant located at the Chowk in Kanpur, right? And if we look at Prabhu Dayal and Roop Kishore Kumar, we see that the same artist may be making many prints or images of Mohandas Gandhi, but may also be making images of Bhagat Singh, Subhash Bose, Lala Lajpat Rai, Tilak, whoever the case may be, which suggests to us that these artists, whatever their own personal view, they understood that there was a place for each one of these patriots in the national narrative. Now we can say, I think that the abundance of images of Gandhi suggests that Gandhi in many ways was predominant. And I know that there are many people today, and there were in fact many people even back then, who took a different view. They thought the revolutionaries, as they were called, that is people who belonged to the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, people like Bhagat Singh, Rajguru, Sukhdev, Chandrasekhar Azad, that these people were more popular in some ways. I don't think that's the case at all, because we also have to remember that all of these people of the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, they have a very fleeting existence. Many of them are martyred when they're very young. Gandhi, there's a kind of longevity. I mean, let's not forget that his political career begins in South Africa and then extends until his assassination on 30th January 1948. I mean, that's a period of over 5 decades, you see, all right? So the same printmaker may actually accommodate all of them simply by suggesting through his artwork that all of these people have a certain place in the narrative. Now we can answer your question in a more complex way. I'll just give a very brief illustration, and that would be to see how people are positioned within a certain print. So let's take the case of the print that you had mentioned. So there's a very famous print which shows Shivaji and Maharana Pratap on either side, and then in the middle you get the life story of Subhash Bose inscribed in the words Jai Hind. Okay, so within those the letters, the artist actually portrayed the entire life of Subhash Bose, or the major incidents of the life of Subhash Bose. What the printmaker there is trying to suggest is something that is very interesting. And that is that in some ways he is placing Subhash Bose in the lineage of Shivaji, okay, Maharana Pratap. Sometimes Prithviraj Chauhan will also figure into some of these. What is the argument there then that the printmaker is making? Because what I'm suggesting is an argument is being made. The argument that is being made there is that contrary to the British representation of India as a country where there were no men. See, there's a British argument from the late 18th century that India has no men. They're only women. The men are like women. They're effeminate. So in this case, what is being suggested is that we actually had a martial past. Now we have to recover this martial past. We have to make people aware of it. And we have to understand that people like Bhagat Singh, or as in this print, Subhash Bose, are the inheritors of this martial past. And of course, you might ask, so is this print implicitly a critique of Gandhi and Ahimsa? Not necessarily, because a printmaker may be saying, look, there are different ways in which we can try to advocate for freedom. And all of these ways complement each other. As in the Gita, what does the Gita says? There are different paths. Okay, there is Gyan Yoga, there's Bhakti Yoga, there's Karam Yoga. Some people reach what we might call spiritual emancipation through bhakti. Some achieve it through intellectual reasoning. Some achieve it through work, through seva. Right? So this may be the way in which the printmaker is thinking, perhaps.
And also, talking about Gandhi, like whatever we know today versus what we see in the book, that he was, you mentioned a picture where he was, the first Indian who was treated as an equal. So he is also somebody who's shown as a great leader, not just somebody who's spiritual, because there is a picture of him with Jesus, with Krishna. And if you would like to sort of elaborate on that, what message is that giving?
Yes. See, I think there is no question that Mohandas Gandhi was the most distinct, extraordinary individual of the last several hundred years of Indian history. I would go so far as to say the only parallel we have in terms of the richness of the life, the richness of the representations, you'd have to go back to the life of the Buddha. Right? I know that this is not a view that is common, particularly in today's political climate in India, but that is certainly the view that the printmakers had. That is the important thing. It's not what I myself might hold, what my views might be. I'm saying the print suggests that, because what do we see in the prints? When Mohandas Gandhi was assassinated, when Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated, the printmakers, without hesitation, a great many of them in many different ways, many of these artists, chitrakars, what did they do? They showed Gandhi in the company of Jesus and the Buddha. All right? Now, let's recognize that Gandhi is not the founder of a religion. Buddha is the founder of what becomes Buddhism. Jesus becomes the founder of what later becomes Christianity. But the printmaker, the artist, is going so far as to suggest that Gandhi is almost, can be seen in the company of a founder of a religion. But what is also distinct to Gandhi is that you will see a huge number of prints where he is shown with Nehru, with Patel, with Malviya, with Lajpat Rai, with Tilak, right? With Annie Besant perhaps. Why? Because that's suggesting that, well, unlike the sants that we had, unlike Kabir, Tulsidas, Surdas, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the Veera Shaivas, unlike all of these sants that we had, because India had a great tradition of what today would be called medieval poet saints, right? Medieval era poet saints, that Gandhi was also someone who was a political activist. And so you have to place him in the company of Nehru and Patel and Maulana Azad as someone who was among the principal people who orchestrated our freedom from colonial rule. Right? Now, this cannot be said of anyone else. You will not see any printmaker ever placing Nehru in the company of Jesus or the Buddha or Azad or Patel. And this is the singularity of Gandhi.
I'll get back one step. You mentioned that the English thought that Indian men were not much of men.
Yes.
Effeminate.
Yeah.
There was also a chapter in your book about Rani Lakshmibai.
Yes.
Where an Englishman called her the only man of Indian mutiny.
Yeah.
So two questions basically. What do you make of this name? And secondly, how do you think in women, what sort of treatment have women been given when we talk about like in the Indian nationalistic history?
Yes. All right. So with respect to the Rani of Jhansi, Lakshmi Bai, see, there was a British view. There was one British officer at that time who said that, the Rani of Jhansi is the greatest of Indian men. All right? So, because the suggestion there was that such was her bravery, such was her bravery that it was exemplary. That she was not only as brave as any other Indian man, but she was the bravest of the lot. Right? Now, you see, you can of course read it as a great compliment to the Rani of Jhansi. You can also say that what it does is it says that Indian men are not really quite men. Okay, so you see, it's a backhanded compliment in a way, as we would say.
Not a great compliment for the women as well. Okay, why can't a woman be as
well, so you see that's another layer of interpretation, because of course a woman should be womanly as a man should be manly. But you see, this is again where Gandhi is very distinct. I'm bringing in Gandhi back in here again, because what was Gandhi's view? Gandhi's view was a woman should always be a woman, but should bring out the best of the man in her. A man should always be a man, but he should bring out the best of the woman in him. That there is no one who is only purely a man or purely a woman. And that is why in Indian art, we have the whole tradition of the Ardh Nari Ishvara. God as half male, half female, right? You go to Mahabalipuram and you see this wonderful sculpture where one half is female and one half is male of the same figure. Right? And this is a representation of Indian art that is to be found all over the country. Okay, so that would be my response to the first question.
And the second question, there was an observation that big men dominated the space.
Right. But I was going to get to the question really because the whole idea that she's the the biggest of the men. I mean, this is of course, as I said, a testament to the fact that she had displayed exemplary bravery and all of that. And we'd have to get into the complicated history of the Rani of Jhansi, how she inherited the throne, what were her difficulties with the British. So that's a long story, part of which I tell in the book. But I wanted to get to the other half of your question, and that was the role of women in the independence movement and how that's been represented. And I think that some of the historians have correctly argued that one of the problems is that in these images and the representations we get in these images, we see the female predominantly as Bharat Mata. Now, there is no question, I'll return to this in just a moment, there is no question that you definitely do have prints where you see Annie Besant, Sarojini Naidu, the occasional print where you might see someone like Vijay Lakshmi Pandit or Rajkumari Amrit Kaur, right? Who was again a close associate of Gandhi as well, and an important player in the nationalist movement, in the freedom struggle. But I think that the general critique that these prints on the whole are really prints of great male leaders. Okay, I think this argument in general is true, but we would then have to see those prints which show not Nehru or Gandhi or a leader in the singular, but which show a certain set of events. So, for example, if you see a print which shows the picketing of liquor shops, then you will see the involvement of women. Right? You'll see the involvement of women, and I think that I think it can be argued that there is now a substantial amount of work which suggests that women obviously had a role to play, a significant role in various ways. There were various satyagrahas, even Kasturba, who is generally being sidelined and ignored. That is Gandhi's wife, who has generally been ignored in many of the conventional histories. We know that Kasturba very often took over the role of her husband, of Bapu, when he was put in jail. And this first started in South Africa. It started in South Africa, where when Gandhi was imprisoned, then Kasturba took over his role and actually led the satyagraha. And I think that there were many such occasions, certainly in India itself. But to properly address the question, we'd have to spend a lot of time, because we'd have to then look at the whole historiography of the nationalist movement, how the nationalist movement developed and how historians have written about it over the course of, the last 7 decades or so. Yeah.
So I would like to ask a few questions about real politics that is happening. You talk about diversity, and artists clearly respected that diversity. And you've also mentioned in the book that the India that you grew up in has largely vanished.
Yes.
So for anybody who is from that generation and somebody who's reading history or getting to know everything through social media and everything, how does your book sort of give a fresh perspective, and the perspective can be revisited?
Yes. Well, so when I wrote in the book that the India that I grew up in has largely vanished, I should be very clear, because I don't want to present an idealistic representation of India of the 1960s or 1970s. It is, I think, no doubt the case that at least looking at it in relationship to our times, it seems a far more peaceful time. You didn't have the kind of incidents that we've witnessed in India in the last so many years, where someone merely suspected of transporting meat is then suddenly lynched. You didn't have things of that kind. You didn't have people who were targeted randomly on the basis of their religion, okay, or because they happen to be a Dalit, right? When we were growing up, frankly, we weren't even aware. I don't think I was aware. I don't know any of my friends when they were 13 or 14 years old who were aware of what caste they belonged to, right? Now, but at the same time, I'm saying I don't want to be idealistic, because, as a scholar, I know that the public schools that we have, the leading public schools that we have in Delhi, and the same can be said exactly for Calcutta, for Bombay, for all of these cities, these leading public schools are predominant student body is upper caste Hindu. You can have so many seats reserved for the economically weaker section, as it's called in India, right? But if you're looking at the schools, and number of studies have shown that. Now, if you go to Sanskriti, you go to Springdales, you go to schools like that in Delhi, these schools are predominantly upper caste, Hindu, and upper class as well. Now, I think that the school that I went to, which was a very progressive school, Springdale School, right? This is a school where, as I said, we were not conscious of many of these things. But one of the reasons we weren't really conscious of it was because we never had to contend with the difference. That is to say that I don't think that a single classmate of mine was a Muslim. When I think back on whom I knew, there were a few Sikhs, yes. I don't think there was a single Muslim that I ever encountered at that school. Now, there may have been, but in a way they were invisible, you see. Okay? So that's why I don't want to idealize it, but at the same time, I'm suggesting that there was a kind of a innocence. In the 60s and 70s, we also had inherited the Nehruvian dream of secularism in many ways. That dream was very much alive. I'm not saying there were no communal rights in India. There were occasional communal rights here and there, but on the whole, things were not communalized in the way in which they are unquestionably communalized today and have been for decades, Right? So that's really what I was trying to suggest.
Yeah, and my last question is, we've seen historians openly taking sides or debating. Also, political leaders are saying that, history should be rewritten.
Yes.
Because earlier it was written with a certain color, certain bias.
Yeah.
So for a young generation or anybody who's new, there is a certain loss of credibility there.
Yes.
Like, how do you trust when they're openly taking sides? So what do you have to say on that? Because that is an important issue.
Well, you see, as a scholar, as a professional historian, I mean, that's a question I think about all the time. And it's a question I have addressed very extensively in my writings over the last 30 years, including in a book called The History of History, Politics and Scholarship in Modern India, published by Oxford University Press in 2003. Now, in this book, I address this question directly. That entire book is, it's not about, see, when we say the history of history, the book is not about, okay, what was Shivaji doing at such time, such and such time, or what happened during, random example, what happened during the Quit India movement. No, the book is about how have historians written about it and what is the politics of their view. Okay, because I have to say at the outset here that, you see, the common view is that historians should try to write without what we call bias, or what sometimes people call prejudice. Now, of course, in a certain sense, that is correct. That as a scholar, I am duty bound. If I'm going to be true to my profession, I'm duty bound that when I'm going to write on something, that I want to assess all the evidence and come to as reasoned a view. But it's as reasoned a view. There is no such thing as pure objectivity over here whatsoever. Okay, you look at the evidence and you say, this is how the evidence seems to present itself. All right. Now, this is really the answer to your question. Number one, that yes, there is reason for young people to be concerned, particularly young people to be concerned, because they look to the past and they say, okay, what do we understand about the life of Shivaji? What does it teach us? And if historians are offering radically different views, then the question is, which view is more reasonable? And that's where then you have to say that, well, we have to assess the evidence. We have to see how the historian uses a school of interpretation, right? What is the nature of their reasoning? And what is the imagination that they bring to their work? What do I mean? Let's take a very simple illustration. It is being argued that Shivaji, by some people, that Shivaji should be viewed as a founding father of Hindu nationalism. Now, I think that this is a view that we should seriously put into question. I think this is an objectionable view. Because the first question that we have to ask is, what did Shivaji even understand by the idea of a nation? He might be thinking of a Maratha nation, but a Maratha nation and the nation of India are not the same thing. Okay? What was even Shivaji's extent of familiarity with the vast cultural, linguistic diversity of India? You cannot think of him as a nation builder in the way in which you might think of Jawaharlal Nehru as a nation builder. It's just not possible. So when we want to say that Shivaji should be viewed as a founding father of Hindu nationalism, or let's modify it, some might say, okay, let's not say Hindu, let's say Indian nationalism. Well, I think even that is actually questionable. It's questionable because, for the reason I've mentioned, that what was Shivaji's conception of something called the Indian nation state? Okay. Now, to what extent was he self-consciously acting as a Hindu ruler? It's a very interesting question. That one is a very interesting question because of course we know that he saw Aurangzeb as his opponent, right? He had other opponents as well, but he saw Aurangzeb, the Mughal emperor, as his opponent, and he may very well have seen the Mughals as foreigners. Even that's possible. But that doesn't mean that he saw all Muslims as foreigners. That's not the same thing. Those are two different things. He might see Aurangzeb and the Mughal emperor as a usurper, that look, they really shouldn't be ruling this part of the world, right? Because they're not indigenous to India. Although that's a question, we could say that, well, yeah, but Aurangzeb's ancestors had been around for 150 years after all. And then who is indigenous to India, right? The people who are indigenous to India are not the ones who are ruling India at all. So you see what I'm talking about, that we would have to start asking all of these questions in order to be able to arrive at what we could call a reasoned or judicious estimate of who was Shivaji, what kind of person was he. If he was a staunch Hindu, why did he have such a large number of Muslims serving in his army, for example? right?
Right.
So we'd have to ask these questions.
So this discussion can go on, and I truly have a lot more questions to ask you, but I think it's better to read the book and understand. So for now, thank you so much for your time, and
My
thank you
pleasure.
for watching.
My pleasure. Thank you.